Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Colorado. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The records begin simply enough: an 1871 land transaction in Crow Hollow, a wind-scoured patch of Colorado territory not far from the old wagon routes that once led toward Bent's Fort. The buyer was listed as Mr. Joseph Callahan, age 42, of Irish descent, and his wife, Eliza, 31. The clerk, E.H. Merrill, noted in his margin that the buyer spoke with a rigid politeness and that his wife kept her hands folded, eyes fixed at her shoes. Few details beyond that survive, but a survey map still marks the cabin's location along a dry creek bed south of Las Animas County. In those days, this land was still haunted by what had taken place just a few years earlier, the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where Colorado militia slaughtered a Cheyenne and Arapaho camp under the illusion of protection. The horror of that act left the settlers uneasy, their sense of righteousness tainted by what they called necessary savagery. The Callahans arrived into that moral twilight, part of a slow migration westward that sought peace and redemption in isolation. Locals later said that Joseph spoke often of building a godly life away from man's corruption. He built a modest homestead, single room, dirt floor, low rafters blackened by smoke. Eliza tended the hearth, planted herbs near the door, and was sometimes seen walking at dusk, murmuring verses no one recognized. The nearest neighbor, Thomas Rayner, wrote in his 1872 diary that they looked more like exiles than settlers, people who carried punishment inside them. By autumn, whispers began that the Callahans refused visitors. Altogether, they turned away a traveling reverend. They ignored the census man, and one night, according to Rayner, a lantern moved through their house long after the lamps of Crow Hollow went dead, as though someone were pacing. Then came the sound, low moaning carried by the wind, which some swore was a woman's voice, but out there, the prairie twisted everything into ghosts. Still, when the post rider Harlan Pike passed by that winter, he found the Callahans' barn door unlatched, oxen untended, and the hearth cold. He knocked and waited, hearing only the creak of the rafters. He returned to town uneasy, telling the sheriff that something's wrong up there, something don't want company. When spring thawed the plains, the sheriff and a doctor rode out. Inside that cabin they found signs of life, a loaf half cut, a coat hung by the door, but no people. The neighbors took it as another failed homestead, one more dream swallowed by dust. But a month later, a trapper claimed he saw Eliza Callahan alone near the creek, her dress torn, hair streaked with mud, walking against the wind as if she were following someone unseen. 2 months after that sighting, a small bundle arrived at the Las Animas post office, addressed simply to Reverend A. Mathis, Pueblo Circuit. Inside was a damp, mud-stained ledger bearing the initials J.C. and several pages written in a tight, deliberate hand. Mathis, a traveling preacher known for documenting frontier conversions, kept the book in his effects until his death in 1889, when it was found among church records labeled Confessional, Unclear Origin. What he read disturbed him deeply. The entries described the Callahans' life in Crow Hollow in unsettling detail. Daily prayers for cleansing, repeated mentions of the test of flesh, and a peculiar refrain, to bind the sin, one must share it. Mathis copied a few lines into his personal notebook, noting that Joseph seemed consumed by the idea that moral corruption must be faced bodily, not shunned. The handwriting grew erratic by mid-1872. Several entries referenced our blessed work and Eliza's obedience. Then, abruptly, a passage read, "She hesitates now. The Spirit has shown her weakness, and weakness is what spreads the disease." That same month, townspeople remembered Joseph riding into Las Animas alone, purchasing lime and rope, and asking the storekeeper how long it took for bones to turn white in open air. The clerk, thinking it a grim joke, never reported it. One name appears in the later pages, Dr. Horace Griggs, a frontier physician who once testified in Denver about the aftermath of the Sand Creek killings. His notes, found decades later in a private collection, reference a religious settler couple practicing mortification rites near Crow Hollow. Griggs wrote that their behavior mirrored penitential delusions he had observed among traumatized survivors of that earlier massacre. He concluded that violence breeds faith's corruption. By early 1873, no one had seen either Callahan, but Reverend Mathis claimed to have received one more letter, unsigned, bearing a single sentence. "We are almost clean, Father, and when we rise, we shall bring the hollow with us." That phrase puzzled him, "bring the hollow," until he visited the property that autumn. What he described in his travel diary is the first official mention of the cellar. Beneath the cabin's floorboards, he found a hatch leading down to a narrow dugout chamber lined with wooden shelves and small jars filled with what appeared to be preserved animal tissue. He also noted the presence of a second chamber beyond, sealed with clay and smelling of lime. Mathis reported his findings to the county constable, but no formal investigation followed. The frontier was filled with abandoned tragedies. Only years later, when Dr. Griggs published a paper on pathological penance, did anyone connect it back to the Callahans. He mentioned them briefly, without names, citing them as a couple whose search for purity became indistinguishable from desecration. And in the dusty archives of Pueblo County, one unsigned affidavit still remains. They were not cleansed, but consumed. Continue to Part 3. ChatGPT can make mistakes. OpenAI doesn't. By 1875, Crow Hollow had mostly emptied. Drought and disease took their toll, and the few remaining settlers treated the Callahan homestead as a forbidden landmark, a place where you tied your horse far from the door. But two testimonies from that year survive in the county clerk's depositions, both recorded by Deputy Marshal W. H. Dobson. The first came from Jonas Lathrop, a prospector who claimed to have stayed in the abandoned Callahan cabin one cold February night. He described finding the cellar hatch partly open and hearing faint scraping from below, as of something heavy moving, slow and dry. Lathrop said he saw nothing when he looked down, only the smell of lime and the glint of glass jars. Yet when he awoke before dawn, the hatch was closed again, and the dust round it bore the mark of a small barefoot. Dobson's notes add, almost apologetically, that Lathrop was in drink. Still, he underlined one phrase in the statement: barefoot. The second testimony came from Mrs. Lucinda Bray, a widowed schoolteacher passing through on her way to Trinidad. Her account, though more restrained, aligns disturbingly with Lathrop's. She reported stopping near Crow Hollow to rest her mule and seeing a woman in a torn gray dress standing at the doorway of the Callahan cabin. The woman did not move, even when Lucinda called out. Her face looked powdered with dust, or ash, Bray wrote, and when I turned away for a moment, she was gone. Both accounts reached Reverend Mathis, who was still corresponding with Dr. Griggs. In one of his final letters, dated 1877, Mathis wrote, "You were right, Doctor. The wounds of Sand Creek have festered long beyond the field. Here in this hollow, repentance turned inward and began to rot." He added that he intended to return once more, to seal the place in prayer. Whether he ever did is uncertain. No further records mention him after that date. By the 1880 census, Crow Hollow was listed as uninhabited, but maps of the era mark a small cross symbol near the creek bend, perhaps a surveyor's flourish, perhaps a memorial. A traveling newspaper correspondent, Elias Rohn, mentioned the area briefly in an 1883 article on haunted districts of the frontier. He wrote that settlers warned him not to camp there because the air goes dead at sundown, and that his compass swung north and south like a shame preacher. Dr. Griggs's later lectures at the Colorado Territorial Medical Society would again reference these moral contagions spreading in isolated communities. He used the Callahans as a parable, though never by name, of how guilt and religious mania might echo through generations. A student of his, Harold Nevin, noted in his 1891 diary that Griggs seemed haunted by something more personal, claiming that he had seen her himself, the woman in the gray dress, by the creek where the wind cut sideways. The next official mention of the Callahan property appeared in 1886, in the ledger of Sheriff Lyman Coates. His notes, later transcribed by the Bent County Historical Office, record an informal dig conducted by road workers after a wagon wheel sank near the old cabin site. Beneath the packed soil, they found fragments of clothing, a small rusted buckle, and what Coates described as remnants of human material degraded by lime. The sheriff ordered a full excavation over 2 days. Witness statements from that effort survive, though many lines are smudged with age. One reads, "We found 3 jars intact, each sealed with wax and containing what looked to be hearts or similar organ." Dr. Horace Griggs, now nearing retirement, was summoned from Pueblo to inspect the discovery. His field report still sits in the archives of the Colorado Historical Society, misfiled under medical anomalies. In it, he speculated that the remains had been buried deliberately as part of a ritual of penitential purification. He wrote, "The conditions resemble those encountered among victims of religious frenzy, where moral sickness manifests through the handling of flesh, the line between sacrifice and salvation blurring entirely." Griggs referenced the Sand Creek Massacre again, noting that such acts of atonement through imitation were not unheard of among survivors of collective violence. He implied cautiously that Joseph Callahan might have witnessed the aftermath of those killings or served with the militia. His handwriting trails off after that suggestion. The sheriff's crew eventually unearthed the remains of at least 2 adults and 1 child. No identification was made, but Coates's note, written in pencil at the bottom of the report, reads simply, "One skull showed signs of fire." The artifacts were boxed and sent to Denver for analysis, but they vanished in transit. An 1887 newspaper from Trinidad mentioned the incident only in passing, calling it a gruesome curiosity best forgotten. Years later, when Griggs died in 1890, his personal effects included one of the wax-sealed jars. The curator, who catalogued it decades later, described it as the most disturbing object ever entrusted to this institution, though he provided no photograph. Meanwhile, local folklore thickened. Ranch hands passing through Crow Hollow told of hoofbeats echoing with no riders. A trapper swore he saw smoke rising from the Callahan chimney in 1888, though the roof had long since collapsed. When a lightning fire swept the area the following spring, it consumed the last traces of the cabin. Only the cellar stones remained, half sunk and mossed over, like teeth from a buried jaw. In the burned earth nearby, one of the road crewmen, Eddie Flynn, claimed he found a tarnished locket engraved with the initials E.C. Inside, beneath cracked glass, was a lock of dark hair and a slip of paper that read, "Clean now, clean." After the 1886 excavation, most officials considered the Callahan affair concluded, a grim relic of the early settlement days. Yet in 1889, Deputy Marshal W.H. Dobson, the same officer who had taken those first testimonies years earlier, reopened the file on his own accord. What drove him to do so remains unclear, but his surviving correspondence with the Pueblo Sheriff's Office reveals an obsession that consumed his final year. Dobson believed the Crow Hollow remains didn't match the ages of Joseph and Eliza Callahan. He wrote, "These bones belong to others, perhaps the first of many they tried to make pure." He convinced a young undertaker, Samuel Dyer, to accompany him back to the site that September. Dyer's recollection, recorded much later, describes a night thick with lightning and wind, the kind of weather that makes the prairie feel alive. They camped near the creek where the cabin had stood. In his deposition to the coroner months later, Dyer stated, "The ground seemed to breathe when the storm came on." He, Dobson, went to the cellar stones with his lantern, muttering that he heard something underneath. Dobson had brought shovels, convinced more evidence lay buried. He told Dyer that one of the original jars had never been shipped to Denver, that Griggs had kept one for himself, and perhaps others did too. The undertaker said he left the deputy digging alone near midnight. When he returned, Dobson was gone. The search party found no body, only his lantern, still burning, placed neatly atop a broken stone. The earth around it had caved slightly, as if hollow beneath. They marked the spot, but didn't dig. The sheriff's order was to let the dead stay under God's cover. Months later, a hunter in Baca County swore he saw a man resembling Dobson walking along the dry bed of the Purgatoire River, his clothes ragged, his face pale as ash, when called. 2, the figure turned and said, "We finished what he started," before vanishing into the ravine. Such tales might have been dismissed entirely if not for a note that surfaced in 1892, a slip of paper found pressed between the pages of Reverend Mathis's old journal when it was donated to the church archives. The handwriting was not Mathis's, but it read, "He dug where the hollow still breathes. I heard them whisper my name." Scholars of the era saw in these accounts another echo of frontier guilt, much like the psychic wounds left after Sand Creek, an unhealed moral infection seeping through isolated communities. One historian, Agnes Whitaker, wrote in her 1903 thesis that the Callahan case is the most potent example of the madness that follows when faith meets violence unchecked. After 1890, the land at Crow Hollow passed quietly to the county. No one farmed it again. Surveyors avoided it, claiming compasses spun wrong near the old foundations. And when the wind rose at dusk, some said it carried the faint rhythm of a shovel striking earth. When Sheriff Lyman Coates retired in 1894, he turned over his ledgers to the county courthouse. Among the faded pages was a section marked private, not for filing, where he recorded observations that never made it into official reports. The handwriting was cramped, each word pressed deep into the paper. One entry from that summer reads, "A complaint came from the roadmen again, about sounds under the ground at Crow Hollow. They swear it is the wind. Yet the wind does not knock 3 times, pause, and knock again." Coates had never been a superstitious man, but he returned to the site accompanied by a surveyor, Eli Morrow, and the young clerk Henry Clate. Their sworn statements remain in the courthouse annex, preserved in brittle onion skin paper. Morrow wrote that as they measured the property line, his horse balked and refused to cross the dried creek bed. He claimed the air was thick with the scent of burnt lime and wet ashes, though it hadn't rained in weeks. When they reached the old cellar pit, Coates noted an odd depression. The ground subsided by nearly 2 feet since his last visit. He poked the soil with his walking stick and recorded that it gave with a hollow sound, as though a chamber below had emptied itself. That evening, the 3 men camped nearby. In the dark, they heard a rhythmic noise, not unlike distant digging. Coates wrote that it came in waves, always from beneath. When they returned the next morning, the depression had deepened further. Clate swore he saw something glinting in the disturbed soil, a rusted buckle identical to the ones found during the 1886 excavation. The sheriff ordered the area fenced off. His final note in that ledger reads, "Whatever is left down there still moves, or else memory itself has weight." After Coates's death in 1898, his son donated the ledgers to the Colorado Territorial Archives, where they sat noticed until historian Agnes Whitaker cited them in her later research. She wrote that Crow Hollow was an invisible scar in the landscape, a site where moral fever sank into the earth. Interestingly, Whitaker compared the Callahan case to the lingering cultural trauma after the Sand Creek massacre, suggesting that both events represented the frontier's failure to reconcile its own righteousness. Her correspondence with Denver archivist Dr. Milo Hanford mentions that when she visited the area in 1901, she collected a fragment of glass, perhaps one of the original jars. In her letters, she described it as curved like a heart, rimmed with white dust, and humming when touched. Hanford dismissed it as imagination. Yet a week after receiving her parcel, he reported hearing faint tapping from his storage trunk at night. He stopped writing soon after. And so, even as the century turned and the frontier faded into history, Crow Hollow refused to settle into dust. In 1903, Professor Harold Nevin of the Colorado College of Medicine, a former student of Dr. Horace Griggs, announced an independent investigation into psychosocial manifestations of guilt in post-frontier settlements. His field notes, rediscovered decades later, form one of the last first-hand accounts of anyone entering Crow Hollow before the land was finally condemned. Nevin's expedition consisted of himself, a photographer named Albert Raines, and a local guide, Mrs. Sarah Bell, who knew the surrounding hills. They arrived in late autumn, the kind of week when the air carries the smell of frost, even before snow falls. Nevin's first impression was that the hollow feels unburied. He wrote that the soil seemed to absorb sound, that even their footsteps failed to echo. The cellar pit was still visible, a sunken oval of gray dirt lined with cracked stones. Nevin measured its depth and found it exceeded the 1886 records by nearly a foot, though no recent digging was apparent. Beneath a collapsed beam, they uncovered fragments of wood and cloth, and what Raines described as an empty jar fused to the earth, edges curled like petals. When they returned to their tent that night, the guide remarked she'd seen movement near the pit, a low, dark shape circling the hollow. Raines later insisted it was just the shadow of their own lantern. But the following morning they found tracks, feline, large, pressed deep into the frost. Nevin noted that the prints led toward the creek and vanished at the waterline. He referenced the old Callahan ledger and suggested the animal may be the persistence of association, symbolic or otherwise, impressed upon this soil by long repetition. In simpler words, he believed fear itself could leave a residue. Nevin's final report to the college was never published. The draft found among his papers concludes, "In Crow Hollow, the more imagination becomes tactile. Whatever occurred here between 1871 and 1873 fused faith with decay until they were one substance, as inseparable as the lime that preserves corruption." Within weeks of returning to Colorado Springs, Nevin fell ill with what he called the hollow fever. His diary ends abruptly with a half-written sentence. "I hear them still, not the dead, but the ones who pray beneath." As for Albert Raines, he attempted to develop his photographs, but found every plate spoiled by fogging and faint circular marks, as though something had breathed against the lens. Only one image remains partially legible, a blurred outline of two figures standing by a pit, and in the far left corner, the faint gleam of two small lights level with the ground. The college quietly closed its inquiry. Years later, when Agnes Whitaker wrote her final paper comparing the Sand Creek aftermath to secondary hauntings of conscience, she mentioned Nevin only once, calling him a man who saw too much of what remains when faith rots. By 1905, the frontier had become history, and Colorado's old homesteads were being reassessed for legal titles. One curious entry appeared in the county property ledgers that spring, a claim filed by Mr. Edward Callahan, age 27, from Kansas City, stating inheritance rights to the former estate of Joseph and Eliza Callahan of Crow Hollow. Clerks noted that he bore a striking resemblance to descriptions of Joseph, though younger, thinner, and pale, as if long unwell. He arrived alone, traveling by train and mule, and asked no questions about the site's past. His only request was for access to collect remaining effects. The assessor who accompanied him, Mr. Otis Crane, later recounted the journey in a letter to his sister. He spoke softly, avoided my eyes, and carried no luggage but a single wooden case. I asked if he was kin to the Callahans, and he said, "I am what's left." Crane described reaching the hollow after dusk. The land lay silent, its grasses thin and gray. They camped by the creek, near the foundation stones. Edward spent the evening walking the perimeter, muttering prayers. At one point Crane heard him whisper, "You buried too deep." By morning, the young man seemed calmer. He produced a folded paper bearing Reverend Mathis's old signature, a transfer of spiritual guardianship for the Crow Hollow tract. The assessor, unsure what that meant, recorded the claim as provisional. Edward signed once, then added a second signature beneath it in smaller script. E.C., by his mercy restored. Later that day, Crane saw him descend into the old pit, carrying his wooden case. He remained below for nearly an hour. When he returned, he appeared dazed and trembling. "It's empty now," he said. "They've moved on." Crane assumed he meant the remains had long decayed, but when he looked into the pit, he saw fresh soil, recently turned, though no shovel wet, is visible. That night, Edward burned his papers and left before dawn. The mule tracks followed the road east for several miles before disappearing near the ridge. The claim was never finalized. Weeks later, the assessor's office received a small parcel wrapped in linen, postmarked from Trinidad. Inside was the same wooden case, now filled with gray dust, and a single scrap of paper reading, "Forgiven." It was signed only E.C. After that, no further Callahan family records were filed anywhere in the territory. The case was closed for good. Yet, in 1907, a rancher repairing his fence along the edge of Crow Hollow reported seeing a man standing in the dry creek bed at dusk, hands clasped like a preacher, watching the horizon. When he approached, the figure faded into the slope, leaving behind a single footprint, bare, small, and pressed deep into the clay. In 1908, a fire swept through the Las Animas County Courthouse. Officially, it was blamed on a faulty stove in the record room, but the blaze started late at night when no one was present. Among the losses were several boxes labeled Crow Hollow, Religious Crimes, Property Conflicts, which included all the Callahan affidavits, Dr. Griggs's final notes, and the ledger of Sheriff Coates. Only one bundle survived, scorched but legible. It contained fragments of correspondence between Reverend Mathis and an unnamed church superior. One letter, dated November 1873, reads, "The woman no longer prays aloud. She sits by the earth and hums like wind through stone. I believe he, Joseph, has convinced her that salvation lies in silence. Yet I cannot say which of them first lost the path." Another scrap, half burned, included this sentence, "If they bury what they love, it is not death, it is discipline." After the fire, archivist Clara Dorsey began reconstructing the missing files from memory and second-hand copies. Her notes mentioned that a few witnesses came forward claiming to have known a young Callahan child, though none could recall seeing more than one. The census of 1871 listed the household as having 2 dependents, yet no birth or death records exist. When Dorsey tried to interview surviving settlers, she met resistance. "They say the hollow took care of its own," she wrote in her reconstruction, "and when I ask how, they look to the floor." A decade later, in 1918, she delivered a lecture at the State Historical Society titled "Moral Contagion on the Frontier." There she referred to Crow Hollow as a local echo of the great wound left by the Sand Creek Massacre, the conscience of Colorado given shape and silence. Her analysis drew ridicule from a few attending journalists who accused her of ghostly moralism. Still, her phrasing endured. Later, historians would repeat that same phrase, the conscience given silence. Privately, Dorsey continued her investigation. A 1919 diary entry from her estate reveals that she visited the hollow herself, accompanied by her assistant, John Peterman. They reported the ground still uneven, the air metallic. Dorsey wrote that she found an iron crucifix half buried near the creek, its base charred and pitted as if struck by lightning. She took it home for study. That winter, her health declined rapidly. Her assistant described her final days as restless. She spoke of footsteps under the floorboards and a whisper repeating her name. After her death, the crucifix was returned to the archives, but its whereabouts today are unknown. When county officials rebuilt the record hall in 1920, they found the new foundation unstable, hollow pockets of air beneath the floor where the fire had burned hottest. The engineers filled them with lime and gravel, sealing them over. For reasons no one could explain, the workers refused to stay after sunset. The final first-hand account linked to Crow Hollow came in 1919, written by Mrs. Sarah Bell, the same local guide who had once accompanied Professor Harold Nevin in 1903. Her testament, as she called it, was discovered years later among the personal papers of a Pueblo librarian and deposited anonymously into the state archives in 1936. Bell began her account by recalling the journey with Nevin, but her tone grew heavier as she wrote. "He was not right when he left there," she said. "Something in that place makes men believe the dirt listens." According to her, after Nevin's death, the college sent letters asking for any surviving notes or samples. Bell ignored them. She claimed that, months after their return from Crow Hollow, she started finding small clumps of lime under her doorstep each morning. as though sifted from some unseen hand. The rest of her testimony shifts from recollection to confession. Belle admitted she had returned once more to the hollow alone, sometime around 1908. The county had already fenced it off, but she slipped through the wire. She described a late summer dusk, heavy with thunder and the smell of iron. She wrote, "The ground was soft near the old pit. When I touched it, it sounded like breathing, slow, steady, from far below." She claimed to have seen movement inside the pit, though the light was fading fast. A shape crouched low, like a big cat with shoulders too human. She dropped her lantern and fled, not looking back until she reached the creek. There, she saw a faint orange glow pulsing from the hollow, rising and falling as if it matched her heartbeat. For years, she told no one. Her testament concludes with one final entry dated January 1919. If they ever open that ground again, they will find what faith can become when it forgets mercy. Tell them not to dig. Tell them not to listen when it calls. Archivists who later examined her manuscript found traces of white powder along the edges, lime dust, chemically consistent with what had been documented at the site decades earlier. Her account reignited scholarly interest briefly in the 1920s, when historian Agnes Whitaker cited it in her unfinished notes on moral infection and collective conscience. She planned a comparative study linking Crow Hollow's psychological residue to that of Sand Creek, suggesting both were examples of spiritual collapse under the weight of unresolved guilt. Whitaker died before completing the work. When her office was cleared in 1928, her assistant found one sealed envelope labeled Crow Hollow, for later. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing 3 words in faded ink, "Still underfoot." The envelope also contained a tiny glass shard, curved, smooth, faintly gray, almost identical to the fragment she had once collected years earlier. No one could determine where she had found the new piece. In the spring of 1920, the last verifiable record concerning Crow Hollow appeared in a minor publication, the Trinidad Gazette, under the heading Local Curiosities. It reported the story of Caleb Minter, a copper miner whose wagon route took him through the abandoned tracks east of Las Animas. His statement was brief but haunting, and it remains the final known eyewitness description before the area was officially condemned. According to Minter, a storm had driven him off course, forcing him to take shelter near the dry creek bed. He recognized the stone outline of a former homestead, likely the Callahan place, and decided to camp there for the night. He wrote, "The wind had a low hum, not the kind that whistles through timber, but one that seems to come from the ground itself. My horse wouldn't eat, just stared toward the cellar stones like something was moving there." As dusk deepened, he noticed faint light flickering beneath the soil. He assumed it was lightning reflecting on pooled water, but the glow persisted, a dull orange pulse rising and falling rhythmically. Around midnight, his mule brayed violently, and when he went to calm it, he saw what he described as a pair of shining eyes low to the ground, the size of lantern glass. He fired his revolver once into the dark, hearing only a dull thud and the sound of scattering dirt. At dawn, Minter found the ground disturbed. Near the pit lay a smooth object half buried in ash, a rounded glass surface, blackened at the edges. When he lifted it, he saw his own reflection warped and faint, as if the glass remembered other faces before his. He wrapped it in canvas and took it to Trinidad, but by the time he reached town, the object had cracked down the center. The Gazette reporter, Thomas Ellery, examined it briefly, describing it as a piece of old photographic glass, curved and smoked, perhaps part of an early daguerreotype. Minter insisted it was thicker, like a jar turned inside out. He refused to speak further after that, selling his mule and leaving town 2 days later. The paper ended the article with a single, almost poetic sentence. "If there are ghosts in Crow Hollow, they no longer walk, they wait beneath." Later that year, county engineers surveyed the land for rerouting a wagon trail. They noted subsidence near the creek and described the soil as unstable, voided underneath. When they filled the depressions with lime, the ground emitted a hissing sound for several minutes, as if air were escaping from a deep cavity, according to one worker's memo. The site was finally sealed under several feet of packed gravel and declared unfit for construction. No further digging permits were issued. Yet even now, in the archives of the Colorado Historical Society, a final notation remains penciled in the corner of the 1920 closure report. Still hearing them below, especially on quiet nights. In 1921, nearly 50 years after the Callahans' arrival in Colorado, a researcher named Dr. Walter Hensley, affiliated with the University of Denver's fledgling Department of Psychology, made one last attempt to document Crow Hollow. Hensley had been studying the effects of isolation on frontier settlers and was particularly intrigued by the recurring phrase found in old letters and testimonies, "The hollow breathes." Determined to capture whatever acoustic phenomena the locals described, he brought with him a portable Edison phonograph and several blank wax cylinders. A mule cart carried his equipment and a hired assistant, Nathan Price, a student who had volunteered for the field trip. They arrived in late summer. Hensley's surviving field notes, later found in the university's archives, detail calm weather and clear skies. He recorded wind direction, barometric pressure, and humidity, all normal. But the first evening, both men heard faint, rhythmic sounds, as though someone were striking packed earth from below. Hensley placed the recording horn near the old cellar depression and began a long exposure session. The first cylinder captured nothing but wind. On the second, he claimed to detect a slow, repeated vibration at intervals too regular for natural origin. The cylinders were boxed and sent back to Denver, where they arrived cracked, though still playable. 2 weeks later, a graduate assistant transcribed portions of the second recording and described faint murmuring consistent with multiple low voices or distant hammering. No definitive conclusion was reached, but the university cataloged the samples under unexplained environmental sounds, Crow Hollow region. 3 months later, the phonograph and cylinders disappeared from storage. The only remaining document is a short letter from Nathan Price to a fellow student, written shortly before he abandoned his studies. He told me not to listen past the 6th rotation. I did anyway. It wasn't wind. It was breathing, then words. Mine. Hensley left the university soon after, citing decline of health and preoccupation with spiritual matters. His final note to the department chair reads simply, "The hollow remembers sound." Over the decades, rumors circulated that one of the cylinders resurfaced in a private collection during the 1930s. A journalist claimed to have played it and heard a woman humming, a man reciting scripture backward, and something striking metal. No verification exists. The item was never located again. Still, the 1921 attempt stands as the last documented investigation before the county permanently sealed access to the area. The official report concluded that subterranean cavities from historical digging were responsible for the noises, but even this explanation acknowledged that the sounds continued for some hours after stabilization. And so, by the time the new road bypassed the site in 1922, Crow Hollow had already begun slipping quietly into myth, its files lost to fire, its witnesses to time, and its story to whispers beneath the Colorado wind. In 1924, the Colorado Historical Society appointed a young archivist named Frederick Lowry to reorganize regional case materials, among them the surviving fragments of the Crow Hollow documentation. Lowry's methodical notes still survive in a private notebook donated to the Society in the 1950s. His writing begins with the detached tone of a researcher, but slowly drifts into something more personal, almost confessional. "These papers have the odor of wet lime," he wrote in his first entry. "It clings to the fingers, no matter how one cleans them." He described finding the scorched correspondence between Reverend Mathis and Dr. Griggs and the half-burned affidavit of Sheriff Coates. He reorganized them by date, tracing the sequence of events as best he could. Then he noticed a pattern. Every decade since 1871 contained at least one new mention, a sighting, a sound, or a rediscovered artifact, as though the hollow demanded to be remembered once every 10 years. Lowry compared these intervals to the natural cycles of the plains, the way the land releases heat or water in rhythm with the seasons. In one marginal note he suggested, perhaps what we call haunting is the earth's own kind of memory, a pressure that repeats until acknowledged. Among the recovered fragments was a partial photograph taken by Albert Raines during Professor Nevin's 1903 expedition. Lowry described it in detail. The two blurred human figures, the open pit, and barely visible in the background, a shadow resembling an animal crouched on its haunches. At first, it seems incidental, he wrote, until you notice that the shadow faces them, not the camera. The archivist sent the image for chemical restoration, but the technician returned it untouched, claiming the emulsion layer had degraded in such a way that the black area moves when light strikes it. Lowry dismissed the report as tried cockery or a handling defect. Yet, weeks later, he wrote that he'd stored the photo in a sealed envelope after noticing the faint odor of iron whenever he examined it. His final entry, dated December 2, 1924, marks the end of his work on the file. It reads, I have completed the index, but the sequence feels unfinished. The last line of the last report says, still hearing them below. Today, while filing, I dropped a paperclip. It hit the floor, then rolled back toward me. The building is level. The floor does not slope. And yet, the clip returned, as if drawn to its origin. Lowry submitted the reorganized archive and resigned shortly thereafter, citing exhaustion. His supervisor noted in the personnel file, Mr. Lowry appeared agitated, complained of hearing low sounds near the basement stacks, though none were detected. He left Denver for good, moving to Kansas, where he took up teaching history. When interviewed years later, he refused to discuss Crow Hollow, saying only, You don't archive the dead. You let them keep their order. By 1926, Crow Hollow had nearly vanished from official conversation, but it began resurfacing in folklore. Rural Colorado newspapers carried fragments of the tale under shifting titles. The Lime Couple, The Breathing Ground, or simply The Callahan Curse. Children dared one another to walk the dry creek bed after dark, claiming that if you pressed your ear to the earth, you could hear slow tapping like someone writing beneath the soil. That same year, a surveyor named Jonas Keir discovered something extraordinary while charting nearby property lines, a folded parchment wedged between stones at the base of a boundary marker. The document, now preserved in the state map collection, appears to be a rough sketch of Crow Hollow as it existed in 1872, showing the cabin, the creek, and most notably, several concentric circles drawn beneath the foundation. Each circle is labeled with words written in cramped script: prayer, sin, flesh, release. At the map's center, one word appears twice, underlined heavily: clean. Experts at the time dismissed the drawing as an unfinished drainage plan, but Keir insisted it looked ritualistic. No one designed circles like that for water, he told a reporter from the Pueblo Herald. That's for worship or confinement. The article received little attention, but Keir's employer, the Frontier Geological Service, quietly stored the map among unrelated survey files. Decades later, when the archives were digitized, analysts confirmed that the handwriting matched that of Joseph Callahan's known ledger entries. Folklorists seized on this revelation. Some argued that Joseph's twisted morality had turned the cellar into a physical manifestation of guilt, a structure built to contain sin rather than escape it. Others suggested that he intended to recreate a form of purification ritual, echoing the misguided moral fervor that had swept across Colorado after Sand Creek, when righteousness blurred into cruelty. Whatever the truth, the circles on the map match the outline of later subsidence reports precisely. Each depression recorded in the ground during the 1880s and 1890s corresponded to one of those original drawn rings. Keir died a year after finding the parchment, his horse found wandering near the same creek bed. The newspaper obituary called it a misadventure, but a friend recalled that his last words had been, "The middle circle wasn't empty." The map eventually reached the Denver archives, where it remains sealed under preservation glass. On certain afternoons, when light falls across the ink at a low angle, archivists claim to see faint indentations around the central word, as though someone had pressed a finger repeatedly into the paper long after the drawing was complete. Each mark falls in perfect rhythm, 5 beats apart, like the pattern of a buried heartbeat. In 1927, a private antiquarian from Santa Fe named Dr. Lionel Crandall acquired several boxes of unclassified Colorado curios from an estate sale of the late archivist Frederick Lowry. Among them, he found one small unmarked envelope containing a curved piece of darkened glass, a water-stained page of notes, and a brass tag stamped CH12. The paper described, in Lowry's unmistakable hand, object believed connected to the Callahan excavation, origin unverified. Crandall, fascinated by tales of early frontier moral sects, invited 2 colleagues to examine the item. He later wrote in a letter to the Santa Fe Historical Quarterly. When sunlight struck it, the glass produced a faint reflection, not of ourselves, but of some interior place. Walls of wood, a man and woman indistinct, standing too still. He assumed it a trick of curvature or exposure residue. Nevertheless, he stored the fragment in a velvet-lined box and labeled it Specimen of Frontier Penance. Weeks later, Crandall began keeping a diary. His first entry was scholarly, comparing Crow Hollow to other frontier cult phenomena. But by mid-February, his tone shifted. "I hear a dull tone from the box when the night wind turns south," he wrote. 5 beats, a pause, then 5 again. Neighbors testified that he worked late, phonographs spinning the old cylinders of regional folk hymns. One record, A Prayer for the Fallen Plains, scratched endlessly on the same refrain, "Cleanse, cleanse, cleanse." On March 3, 1928, Crandall's housekeeper found the study in disarray. The specimen box sat open on the desk, the glass missing. On the wall behind his chair was a circular soot stain, roughly the size of a dinner plate, as if smoke had pressed outward from a single point. Crandall himself was gone. A telegram sent that evening from Trinidad Station recorded a man fitting his description boarding a freight C. "Are eastbound, carrying no luggage." He was never seen again. In Santa Fe, his colleagues cataloged the remaining contents. Beneath his notes, they found a thin slip of parchment, clearly older than the rest. It bore a single line in fading ink. "He has forgiven us. The hollow is whole." The handwriting, experts later noted, matched neither Lowry's nor Crandall's. It was closest to the hand found on Joseph Callahan's 1872 ledger. The brass tag and box were eventually donated to the Denver Historical Society. The tag remains in storage. The box is empty. Its accession file ends with an archivist's remark written in 1930. Contents produced faint odor of lime, advisable to isolate. Folklorists in subsequent decades cited the Crandall disappearance as the moment when the Callahan legend left the realm of documents and entered that of heritage haunting, a moral warning folded into Colorado's cultural memory. Still, among collectors, a rumor persisted that somewhere in the high mesas south of Pueblo, a fragment of blackened glass sometimes surfaces after hard rain, reflecting not the sky above, but the outline of a man and woman standing in silence, waiting for acknowledgement. By 1929, Crow Hollow was considered a lost site, its name removed from most modern maps. Yet that spring, a young anthropologist named Dr. Miriam Lawton, researching abandoned settlements for her doctoral thesis, sought permission from the county to conduct a final soil survey there. She had read the fragmentary papers of Frederick Lowry and the newspaper accounts of Dr. Crandall's disappearance, dismissing them as mythic contagion born of academic echo. Lawton reached the site in late May. Her field notebook, recovered years later, contains clinical notations that grow gradually more erratic. The early pages read like any scientific report: soil composition, pH, evidence of limestone residue. But midway through, her tone changes. "A peculiar pulse beneath the second trench," she wrote. "Soil seems to contract when disturbed, as though exhaling. That night she camped by the creek, recording barometric readings. The phonograph she carried for documentation malfunctioned, repeating fragments of her own voice in playback. "Crow Hollow," it said again and again, in a dull echo like water through stone. In her later entries, she described finding remnants of circular foundations matching those drawn on Joseph Callahan's map, each ring precisely measured, compacted differently, the innermost circle still faintly warm to the touch, despite cool weather. She noted that her compass needle trembled whenever she approached it. Her assistant, John Cates, testified later that Dr. Lawton seemed entranced that evening. She spoke little, only tracing the inner ring with her hand and whispering, "This is where it began." Cates awoke near dawn to the sound of shoveling. Through the mist, he saw her kneeling in the central depression, pale in the half-light. She told him she had uncovered a hollow space and needed to finish her measure. When he approached, she ordered him, "Back! You'll make it close again," she warned. Moments later, the ground beneath her caved slightly, a sigh of falling dust. Cates leapt forward, dragging her away as the pit subsided. They fled without packing their gear. When local deputies arrived later that day, they found the trench filled smooth as if tamped from below. Lawton refused to speak of what she saw except to mutter, "It isn't buried, it's breathing." She left Colorado soon after, her thesis unfinished. In letters to colleagues, she apologized for abandoning the project, adding only, "I mistook a confession for geography." Years later, when her papers were catalogued, one envelope labeled Crow Hollow, "Do not file," contained a single soil sample sealed in wax. The chemical report described an anomalous ratio of carbon to calcium, suggestive of organic lime, essentially bone reduced to powder. The sample remains archived but unexhibited. The label bears her handwriting, faint yet steady. "Return to them." By 1930, the hollow had once again vanished under county jurisdiction, its coordinates lost, its memory folded back into rumor. But travelers still claimed that on some nights, when storms rolled across the plains, flashes of lightning revealed shallow rings in the dirt, circles glowing white like breath made visible. In 1932, the Diocese of Pueblo received an unmarked parcel containing a thin stack of yellowing papers, bound by twine, and a single rosary blackened with age. The documents were titled Recollection of the Hollow, signed only Father James Alton. The priest had served briefly in Trinidad before transferring to a sanatorium in New Mexico, where he died that same year. His manuscript, written in shaky script, recounts a confession he heard in 1915, one he claimed concerned the Callahan name. According to Alton, the penitent was an elderly woman with hair white as clay dust. She came during a thunderstorm, refusing to sit, insisting she must speak before the ground sealed again. She never gave her name, but Alton described a scar on her palm in the shape of a ring and eyes that seemed fixed on something behind me. She said she had lived long after her husband's hand went cold, Alton wrote, that they had tried to cleanse the body to make the soul light enough to rise, but the ground took them instead. She said the prayers grew heavier each year until even silence could not lift them. She told him she had buried the child herself, then sealed the hollow with lime and ash. When the priest pressed her for details, she replied, "The sin was in the saving, not the taking." Before she left, she placed a small glass fragment on the confessional shelf. "Keep it," she said, "so it remembers me clean." Alton kept the shard until his death, wrapped in cloth, noting in his journal that it emitted a faint warmth whenever held. Years later, the nuns who sorted his belongings confirmed finding the item exactly as described. When exposed to light, it displayed a blurred image resembling a woman and child standing by a wooden structure. The photograph experts who examined it said the emulsion was unlike any known process, more etched than printed. Alton's recollection closes with a reflection that scholars later found deeply unsettling. Perhaps Crow Hollow was never a place but a penance. Some confessions do not end. They continue in the soil, repeating the words we will not hear aloud. The Church quietly archived his writings under private testimonies, frontier missions. Yet, a footnote added decades later by the archivist mentions that the rosary accompanying the papers had rusted completely through, leaving small white traces on the parchment that tested positive for calcium oxide. Lime dust again. A rumor among seminarians in the 1940s held that if one prayed over the hollow story at midnight, a whisper would answer, not in Latin or English, but something older, closer to breath. And still, locals around Las Animas sometimes speak of an unseen chapel near the dry creek bed. No walls, no altar, only a low hum that rises with the wind. They call it the listening ground. By 1935, Crow Hollow had receded almost entirely from official memory. The county road curved wide around its forgotten ground, and the mapmakers omitted its name altogether. Only a few archivists and folklorists kept the story alive, exchanging carbon-copied letters about the Callahan case, as though it were an illness rather than a place. One of those letters, dated April 1935, came from Professor Miriam Lawton, the same researcher who had fled the site 6 years earlier. Addressed to the State Geological Survey, it began simply, "The hollow is no longer a depression. It breathes outward now." Her claim went unacknowledged. Within months she vanished from public record. Neighbors near her rented cottage reported strange noises at night, soft tapping through the floorboards, as though the foundation itself were hollow. When the landlord entered after she failed to pay rent, he found her desk undisturbed, and a single line written across an open notebook. "Forgiveness has weight." By winter, snow covered the plains where Crow Hollow had once stood. Ranchers passing through noticed faint, circular mounds rising through the drifts, the old prayer rings reappearing after decades underground. A few rode closer, claiming to hear what sounded like a low wind pushing upward from the earth. One man dismounted to investigate, only to feel warmth radiating through the frozen ground. He left without looking back. When spring came, the mounds were gone again, as though the land had exhaled and settled. The last official acknowledgement of the site appears in a 1936 geological bulletin referencing unstable subsoil due to historic mining or burials. No names were mentioned. The file ends with a line penciled faintly in the margin, almost an echo from the old sheriff's ledger. "Still hearing them below." After that, the archives fall silent. But the folklore never did. Local ranch hands still talk of a black cat that appears on the ridges after storms, larger than it should be, its eyes catching light long after the lightning fades. Travelers who camp near the dry creek sometimes report a smell like burned lime when no fire is near, and on rare nights, when the wind lies still, a faint humming carries across the plains. 5 beats, a pause, then 5 again. Historians who revisit the Callahan records often end their papers with the same uneasy reflection, that perhaps Crow Hollow was not cursed, but remembered, a wound in the moral conscience of a land already scarred by violence like the Sand Creek Massacre, where righteousness twisted into atrocity. In that sense, the Callahans were never alone. They were part of the same long, silent reckoning, the earth holding on to what men could not confess aloud. Today nothing remains but grass and wind. The county deeds list no owner, the road signs bear no name. But on certain nights, under a hard Colorado moon, locals say the ground still shifts, not enough to frighten, just enough to remind. As if the hollow still breathes.